Step out of the vehicle. Give me your ID.
Sir, what legal reason are you detaining me for? The plate authorizes the spot.
Don't argue with me. ID, now.
I'm asking a legal question. What probable cause do you have to demand ID?
You're acting suspicious.
Suspicious isn't a crime.
You are not free to leave.
Captain Brent Harlan stood at the driver's door and told Staff Sergeant Darius D.J. Coleman he was not free to leave. Coleman stayed seated. He kept his hands visible. He asked what legal reason supported detaining him. Harlan did not give a clear offense. He treated Coleman's questions like the problem. Officer Lacey Torres noticed Coleman's phone and pointed out it was recording. Harlan immediately tried to control that. He ordered Coleman to stop recording and keep his hands where they could be seen. Coleman refused to stop recording. He stated he was documenting the contact and that he was not reaching for anything. A bystander, Nina Patel, started recording from a few cars away. At that moment, this stopped being a parking question. It became a detention, captured from more than one angle. Quick pause. Comment where you're watching from. And if you think probable cause shouldn't be optional just because someone has rank, hit like and subscribe. This happened in Texas in a public parking lot near a government office and nearby businesses. Handicap spaces were close to the entrance. People were walking in and out, passing close enough to hear the tone shift. Coleman had parked in a handicap spot because walking long distances was difficult for him. He was in uniform. He was not hiding. He was not causing a scene. He was sitting in his vehicle before going inside. The entire context started because there was no placard hanging from the mirror, but the vehicle had disabled veteran plates. The plate already explained the authorization. That was the first important choice in this story. Verify first or confront first. Captain Harlan chose confrontation. He approached and focused on the missing placard. He told Coleman he could not park there and demanded identification. Coleman did not raise his voice. He did not argue about respect. He pointed out the plate and asked why ID was being demanded if the plate already explained the situation. Harlan repeated the demand. Coleman shifted the encounter to procedure. He asked what probable cause existed to require ID. That question changed the dynamic. It forced Harlan to either explain legal authority or admit the demand was based on preference. Harlan did not explain a specific offense. He labeled Coleman suspicious. Coleman responded in the same controlled way. He challenged the idea that suspicion alone was a crime and redirected Harlan back to the proper step. Run the plate and verify. That was the second important choice. Solve the issue with verification or treat the refusal to hand over ID as defiance. Harlan treated it as defiance. He ordered Coleman to step away from the vehicle. Coleman did not move quickly. He asked if he was being detained. Harlan answered by restricting Coleman's freedom to leave. That was the turning point in the encounter. A routine parking check became a detention without a clearly stated legal basis. Coleman asked what he was being detained for. Harlan framed it as failure to comply. Coleman clarified the issue again. Asking an officer to explain authority was not the same as refusing a lawful order. He kept his tone even. He kept his hands where they could be seen. He kept the focus on one question: what legal reason justified holding him? Harlan did not provide a clear crime. Instead, he tried to control the environment. That was when the phone became the new target. Officer Torres noted the recording. Harlan immediately pushed for the recording to stop while also directing Coleman's hands and posture. Coleman refused to stop recording. He stated he was documenting for accountability and safety. He emphasized he was not reaching into pockets, the console, or any compartment. He stayed seated and still. That removed an excuse officers sometimes rely on. If the person does not move, the encounter cannot be justified as a reaction to movement. It has to stand on the original reason for contact. And the original reason was a parking assumption that could have been verified by the plate. Nina Patel's recording from outside mattered for a different reason. It captured the overall scene, where everyone stood, what the vehicle showed, and how the encounter looked to the public. It also captured the disabled veteran plate as part of the wider frame. Now there were multiple recordings of the same detention. Coleman stayed consistent. He did not perform anger. He did not perform fear. He did not give Harlan anything that would make escalation look reasonable later. He kept the encounter focused on justification, not personality. Harlan kept trying to shift the issue away from the plate and toward obedience. He repeated commands. He implied the problem was cooperation rather than legality. But the more he leaned on rank and repetition, the clearer the record became. This was a detention built from a misunderstanding, then held in place because Coleman asked lawful questions. Captain Brent Harlan kept the detention active and tried to reframe the situation so it looked like Staff Sergeant Darius D.J. Coleman was the problem, not the initial mistake. Harlan repeated the same point about a placard and treated the disabled veteran plate like it did not settle the issue. He kept coming back to one demand: identification. Coleman did not argue about respect or tone. He stayed seated, kept his hands visible, and repeated two questions in order: whether he was being detained and what specific legal reasons supported it. Harlan did not name a clear offense. He tried to build one. He shifted from parking to behavior. He implied that Coleman's refusal to provide ID was non-compliance. Then he implied the recording itself was escalating the contact. Officer Lacey Torres watched the way the detention was developing. She stayed near the captain but did not mirror his intensity. She was paying attention to what would matter later, what was said on camera, what the plate showed, and whether there was any lawful basis being stated. Harlan issued more directions. He tried to control Coleman's hands, posture, and phone at the same time. The commands were structured to create a simple story. The officer gave instructions the citizen refused, and that refusal justified escalation. Coleman refused to give him that story. He stated he was documenting. He stated he was not reaching for anything. He stated he was keeping his hands visible on purpose. He stayed still so there would be no excuse to claim sudden movement or a safety threat. That forced Harlan to rely on the original reason for the stop, and the original reason was a parking assumption that could be checked immediately. Nina Patel continued recording from outside. Her angle showed the broader scene, where the officer stood, where Coleman's hands were, and the vehicle's disabled veteran plate in the frame. At that point, Torres made a suggestion in a low voice: verify the plate through dispatch. It was the simplest off-ramp. It also limited damage. If the plate verified, the detention ended. If it didn't, enforcement became straightforward. Harlan resisted that off-ramp for a moment. His focus was not verification, it was control. He acted like Coleman's calm questions were defiance and acted like compliance was the goal. Coleman stayed consistent. He told Harlan to run the plate. He made it clear that if there was a real violation, verification would show it. Harlan finally did what he could have done at the start. He radioed dispatch and ran the plate. The response came back consistent with what the plate already indicated. The disabled veteran's status was legitimate. The vehicle was tied to Coleman. The parking authorization was not in question. At that moment, Harlan had a choice. He could end the detention cleanly and admit the contact was based on a misunderstanding. Or he could try to protect his ego by shifting the reason after the fact. He tried to shift it. He began talking about policy instead of law. He implied that even if the plate verified, Coleman still had to provide ID because he had been asked. He tried to make the central issue Coleman's cooperation, not the captain's decision to detain without a stated offense. Coleman did not debate in circles. He asked one follow-up that forced clarity. If the plate was verified and no crime existed, what legal basis remained to keep him detained? Harlan could not answer that without admitting the detention was being used to punish Coleman for asking questions. Torres stepped in again, more direct this time. She signaled that the parking concern was resolved and that continuing to hold Coleman would create a bigger problem than releasing him. Harlan's posture shifted. He backed out of the detention in a controlled way, trying to make it look like a normal conclusion rather than a retreat. He told Coleman he could go but he tried to leave a warning behind, as if the lesson was cooperation rather than legality. Coleman did not accept that framing. He stated the key point without raising his voice. The plate had been the answer from the beginning, and this had escalated because verification was skipped. Before ending the contact, Coleman did what people did when they understood accountability. He asked for Harlan's name and badge information. He noted the time. He noted the location. He noted the presence of Officer Torres. He noted that Nina Patel had recorded from outside. He kept it factual. Then he ended the encounter with a short statement that set the boundary. Rights did not require permission, and lawful authority required justification. Harlan left without the outcome he wanted. Coleman stayed seated for a moment longer, still recording the final seconds. No emergency, no crime, no threat. Just a detention that ended only after the plate was finally verified. And Coleman did not treat it like a social media argument. He treated it like the start of a paper trail. After the encounter ended, Staff Sergeant Darius D.J. Coleman did not treat it like a debate. He treated it like documentation. He saved his recording. He contacted Nina Patel and secured her outside angle too. 2 videos meant the department could not later reduce the story to tone or misunderstanding. The angles showed the same core facts. The plate was visible, the detention was stated, and the justification was never clearly named. Within days, Coleman filed a formal complaint with the department's Internal Affairs Professional Standards Unit. He kept it structured. He listed the time, location, and identities he had. He identified the exact moment the contact shifted into detention, when Captain Brent Harlan told him he was not free to leave. Coleman requested specific records: body camera footage from Captain Harlan and Officer Lacey Torres, any additional body cam footage from nearby units who arrived or monitored, any dash camera footage if a patrol unit was positioned in the lot. When Internal Affairs contacted Coleman for intake, they asked what outcome he wanted. Coleman answered in general terms: accountability, training, and the truth on record. That answer mattered because it forced the complaint into a category departments could not dismiss easily. He was not asking them to be nicer. He was pointing to procedure and authority. While the complaint was in process, the video began circulating. Veteran groups shared it. Community pages reposted it. People focused on the same sequence. The plate existed, verification was delayed, and detention was declared anyway. The department responded publicly with controlled language. They acknowledged the video and said the incident was under review. Behind the scenes, the complaint triggered a routine the public rarely saw. Internal Affairs had to pull footage. They had to review the dispatch and CAD logs. They had to compare what officers said on video to what was documented afterward. They had to determine whether the contact matched policy. Coleman stayed consistent during that period. He did not trade insults with strangers online. He did not add new claims. He kept pushing for records and policy language. Then he made the next move that usually changed how a department handled a file. He contacted a civil rights attorney. The attorney did not ask about disrespect. The attorney asked about lawful basis and sequence. They asked how long Coleman was held after the plate was verified. They asked whether the vehicle was blocked in. They asked whether Coleman's ID was demanded again, taken, or run. They asked whether anyone threatened arrest or punishment related to recording. They asked whether the stated reason for detention shifted over time. The attorney told Coleman they were not litigating attitude. They were litigating justification. Coleman's response was simple. That was the same question he asked in the lot, and Captain Harlan never answered it. At that point, the pressure stopped being public attention and became formal risk. Because once attorneys requested records and Internal Affairs had footage and logs in hand, the department had to decide what they could defend on paper and on camera. And if the camera showed a detention without a clear legal reason, the department's problem was no longer the video. It was the record. Once Staff Sergeant Darius D.J. Coleman filed the complaint, and his attorney began requesting records, the department had to treat the incident like a case file, not a comment thread. Internal affairs pulled what mattered first: body camera footage, KAD dispatch logs, and any written documentation created by Captain Brent Harlan or Officer Lacey Torres. The review focused on sequence. It was not about whether Coleman sounded upset. It was about whether a lawful reason existed to demand ID and then announce detention. The main comparison was simple: what was said in the parking lot versus what was later claimed in writing. If the footage showed the disabled veteran plate clearly and showed Harlan still escalating, that narrowed the department's options. They could not reasonably argue that verification was impossible. They could only argue why they chose not to verify first. If any report tried to add a new reason later, something not stated during the encounter, that created a credibility problem. The record would show whether the legal basis existed in real time or was built afterward. Publicly, the department stayed careful. Their statements stayed brief. They were aware of the video and the incident was under review. Privately, supervisors treated it as a risk issue. A captain's decisions carried more weight because captains trained and modeled conduct. If Harlan escalated without clear cause, it raised a bigger question than one bad interaction. It raised whether leadership was using detention as a control tool. During the review, the department moved in two directions at once. First, they tried to contain the narrative. They framed it as a routine contact that became tense, instead of acknowledging that the detention began from a parking assumption that could have been verified immediately. Second, they looked for a resolution that reduced liability. That usually meant corrective action and policy clarification without a public admission. Coleman kept his approach consistent. He did not argue online. He did not threaten people. He kept everything pointed at process: what the policy allowed, what the law required, and what the footage showed. His attorney pressed for the full set of materials: all body cam, all logs, all reports, and the relevant policies and training documents. The request itself changed the department's posture because records were now being prepared with the assumption that others might review them. As the review progressed, the department typically reached a decision point. If the footage clearly contradicted Harlan's justification, they leaned toward corrective action and internal training updates. If they believed they could defend it, they leaned toward a statement that the contact was within policy, even if it looked bad. If the legal exposure was high, they leaned toward resolving it quietly through counsel. No matter which path they chose, one outcome was hard to avoid. The department had to clarify how officers were expected to handle disabled veteran plates and handicap parking. And they had to clarify what actually supported an ID demand in a detention. For Captain Harlan, consequences depended on what the footage showed and what the department could defend. At minimum, leadership had to address why a detention was declared without a clear offense. For Coleman, the result was not about winning an argument. It was about forcing an accurate record. He had stayed calm in the lot, and now the department had to answer in writing for the choices made on camera. When the internal review reached its end, the department did what departments usually did in situations like this. They kept the public message short, and they handled the real decisions internally. The statement stayed controlled. It acknowledged the incident and confirmed a review. It did not debate details. It did not admit wrongdoing in plain language. But internally, the outcome showed up in the places that mattered. Policy guidance was clarified. Supervisors reinforced verification steps. The department emphasized that handicap parking concerns required confirmation before escalation, and that disabled veteran plates were not optional information to ignore. They also clarified how officers were expected to handle ID requests and detentions. If an officer could not articulate a lawful basis, the contact could not be treated like a detention just because the person asked questions. That part was not theoretical. It mattered because the key failure in Coleman's encounter was simple. Captain Brent Harlan used detention language without a clear legal reason, after a plate check could have resolved the issue. For Captain Harlan, the consequences depended on what the footage and records showed. If Bodycam and the bystander angle clearly captured the plate and captured Harlan escalate in any way, the department had to address it as a leadership problem, not a misunderstanding. A captain was expected to model correct decision-making. When a captain escalated without justification, it created risk for everyone under him and risk for the city. So the corrective actions often came in the standard administrative forms: documented counseling, mandatory retraining, and supervisory review. In stronger outcomes, it could affect leadership standing or assignments. The department did not need to publicly announce every step for the steps to be real. For Officer Lacey Torres, the file usually reflected her role in the sequence and what she did or did not do to slow the escalation. Once it became clear the plate was valid and the detention was on camera. For Staff Sergeant Darius DJ Coleman, the result was not about a parking spot. It was about a record that could not be rewritten. He had stayed calm. He had kept his hands visible. He had asked the correct questions. He had documented the detention. He had filed a structured complaint. He had requested the records. And when the process moved slowly, he involved counsel. So the department had to treat the file with seriousness. If legal resolution was discussed, it followed the same logic the attorney gave from the start: justification and sequence. Not attitude, not tone, not whether the veteran could have made it easier. The question was whether the department could defend a detention that began from an assumption and continued without a stated legal basis. Even when departments avoided public admissions, the practical outcome was clear. Guidance changed, oversight tightened, and the behavior that created the problem became harder to repeat quietly. And that was the point. Coleman did not win by getting louder. Coleman won by staying controlled and creating a record that forced accountability. Because the moment an officer says a person is not free to leave, the burden shifts. The system has to justify that restriction with something real, not a label, not irritation, not rank. So here's the question. If you were in Coleman's position and a captain told you that you were not free to leave, but could not name a lawful reason, what would you do? Hand over ID to end it fast, or keep asking for justification on the record? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you've been in a situation where power was used instead of procedure, share what happened. And if you want more stories like this, realistic, modern, and focused on oversight and accountability, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.
She grabbed my arm. I need you to do something right now before she deletes it and posts me online.
Okay, tell me exactly what happened, start to finish.
She rolled up with music, got disrespectful, called me racist, and then she grabbed me. I want this handled.
Stay right here with me. Don't walk toward her.
I'm telling you.
Separately.
Tell me what happened from your side and keep it simple.
He ordered me to turn my music off like he owned the place. Shouted racist phrases at me.
Did you touch him at any point? Grab his arm?
No, I didn't touch him. Not once.
She's lying. She grabbed my arm.
Do you have video of the interaction?
Yes, right here. I've been recording.
Turn around, hands behind your back.
Janelle Carter kept her phone up at chest level, steady like she'd done it 100 times, while Chase Whitaker stood a few feet closer than he needed to, talking fast, louder than the music ever was. He was telling the responding officers that she had grabbed his arm and attacked him, and he wanted them to do something right now, before she deleted everything and posted him online. This is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous, until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part? If one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Before we rewind, tell me where you're watching from, country or state, in the comments. And if you're into stories where cameras, receipts, and calm boundaries beat loud accusations, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. It happened at a Love's gas station on August 29th, 2025. One of those bright, always busy travel stops where people come and go like background noise. Plenty of cameras, plenty of witnesses, and plenty of room for a small confrontation to turn into a police report. Janelle was known there, not famous, just familiar. Staff recognized her face, her car, the way she came in, grabbed what she needed, and left without drama. She wasn't the type employees had to watch, and that mattered later more than anyone realized at the start. Chase wasn't a regular to the staff in the same way. That didn't mean anything by itself, but it meant nobody at the store had a pre-built story about him. So when he started giving officers a confident version of events, the only thing backing it up was his voice. The call that brought police out was a battery complaint. Chase had reported that a woman had battered him. He described her outfit purple and her car, black Mercedes. He said she pulled up with loud music, cursed at him, called him racist, threatened to put him on social media, then grabbed his arm. He told dispatch he wanted officers to hurry. That hurry part wasn't accidental. Chase was trying to control the pace before anyone could slow the story down and test it. When officers arrived, he leaned into urgency. His body language said he wanted them to treat the situation like it was already decided. He kept circling back to the same points: loud music, disrespect, being called racist, and the arm grab. He framed it like he was minding his business and got attacked for it. Janelle's posture stayed different. She didn't perform panic. She didn't do the dramatic hands-up innocence act either. She gave what sounded like a timeline, not a speech. According to her, the music wasn't blasting. She said Chase had aggressively ordered her to turn it off, and it wasn't a request, it was a command. She said he followed her, staying in her space, and she started recording because she didn't trust what he might claim later. She denied touching him at all. And she said the first time he described it as her hitting or grabbing him was after officers were already on scene. That last detail is the kind of detail that can change everything. Because in a lot of parking lot calls, the first story officers hear becomes the default story. Whoever seems calmer gets believed. Whoever sounds most certain gets believed. Whoever uses the right keywords gets believed. But Officer Luis Ramirez and Officer Shannon Price didn't lock onto Chase's certainty. They did something simple that a lot of people don't expect in the middle of a messy accusation. They looked for proof. Janelle already had her phone video. She didn't act like it was a weapon. She treated it like a seatbelt, something you hope you never need, but you're glad you put it on. While one officer kept both parties separated, the other watched the clip, and the video didn't match the claim. On the recording, Chase was seen making the accusation that Janelle had grabbed him, while Janelle was clearly not within arm's reach. Officers estimated she was about 10 feet away when he said it. Not 2 feet. Not close enough for a quick grab. 10 feet. That doesn't just poke a hole in a story. It changes what the story is. Now, the incident wasn't simply a dispute about music. It wasn't even just a disagreement about who was rude first. It became a question of whether Chase had called 911 and accused someone of battery without it happening. And while the officers were processing that, the store employees started adding context. Devin Pike, one of the employees working that shift, told officers Janelle was a regular and didn't cause problems. Another staff member backed it up. Then the shift manager, Tina Alvarez, got involved and told officers she could call a manager to access surveillance footage because there were cameras pointed at the pumps and a good chance the area was covered. That offer mattered. It signaled that the store wasn't afraid of what the cameras would show. It signaled confidence. Chase, meanwhile, didn't have any footage. He didn't have a witness stepping up for him. He had his claim. And then he admitted something that officers often listen for. He had no video proof of her grabbing his arm. In a world where everybody's phone is always out, that's not automatically a lie. Plenty of real incidents don't get recorded, but here, the person he was accusing did have a recording, and it contradicted him in a clean, measurable way. Distance. This is where the power chess part shows up. Chase had tried to use the system as leverage. He used key phrases that make police move fast. Battery, aggressor, hurry, threat to post online. He pushed the idea that he was being targeted and harassed. But Janelle's move wasn't louder. It was cleaner. Record first. Speak second. Keep space. Let the facts carry the weight. The officers didn't rush to make her prove she didn't do it. They did what they were supposed to do. Compare statements to evidence. And once the evidence didn't match Chase's allegation, the direction of the call flipped. Instead of treating Janelle like a suspect, officers started treating Chase's report like the potential offense. He wasn't just mistaken. The accusation was specific. He said she grabbed his arm. He called 911 for it. He wanted immediate action. Yet the only video in play showed him making the claim while she was too far away to have done what he said. That's not a gray area, that's math. At that point, officers detained Chase. His tone shifted, less certainty, more frustration. The officers stayed procedural. They weren't debating him, they were documenting. He was arrested for making a false report. On top of that, he was cited for disorderly conduct and obstruction, based on how he acted during the investigation and response. Janelle wasn't celebrated. She wasn't treated like a hero. She was treated like what she was, the person who didn't lie, didn't escalate, and had receipts. Before officers cleared the scene, they gave her contact information and asked her to send any additional videos she had for the case. That detail is important too. It showed they were building the report around evidence, not around whoever shouted first. And just like that, a moment that could have gone sideways at a gas station ended with the person who made the accusation being the one put in cuffs. As soon as Chase Whitaker realized the call wasn't going the way he expected, his whole strategy changed. A minute earlier, he'd been pushing urgency, trying to make the officers treat his story like it was already proven. But the second officer, Luis Ramirez, pointed out the distance issue on Janelle Carter's video. Chase stopped acting like the victim of a battery and started acting like someone trying to talk his way out of consequences. He began reframing. He leaned into the idea that the whole thing was a misunderstanding. He tried to make it about feelings instead of facts. He tried to make it about respect again. But police reports don't run on vibes. They run on timelines. Officer Shannon Price did what good officers do in messy public disputes. She separated the noise from the measurable. She kept asking the same kinds of questions: where everyone stood when the supposed contact happened, how it happened, what came before it, and what proof existed of any of it. Chase's answer kept landing in the same place. He didn't have proof of the arm grab, and the only video being shown didn't support his claim. And Janelle didn't try to win the conversation. She stayed in her lane. She kept her voice level. She kept space between herself and Chase. She let the record speak. That's the part a lot of people don't understand until they're in it. Calm isn't weakness. Calm is control. While Chase was detained, the store side of the story got even clearer. Devin Pike and shift manager Tina Alvarez weren't trying to take sides emotionally. They were doing something more useful than that. They were offering context and access. They explained to the officers that Janelle was a regular who didn't cause problems. Not perfect, not an angel, just consistent. The kind of customer who didn't bring drama into their store. That alone didn't prove innocence. But it mattered because it lowered the odds that she randomly snapped into violence at a pump. Then Tina made the next move that pushed the whole situation from a parking lot argument into a documented case. She initiated the process to get surveillance. Love's Locations didn't just hand footage out to anybody, and Tina knew it. She called for a manager and started the standard chain to access camera angles. The officers didn't treat it like overkill. They treated it like confirmation. Because if the cameras showed no physical contact, then this was bigger than a rude exchange. It was a false report with a named person and a serious allegation. And here's something people don't talk about enough. A false report doesn't just waste time. It puts a target on someone who didn't do anything. It invites escalation. It can become an arrest that never should have happened. That's why the tiny detail mattered so much. the distance on the phone video. If Janelle hadn't been recording, the officers would have been standing there with two competing stories and one person insisting he was attacked. In plenty of places, that's enough to make the wrong decision in the moment. Instead, the officers had a clip that froze reality. When Chase was taken into custody, it didn't look dramatic. It looked procedural. He was searched, handcuffed, and walked to the patrol vehicle. The energy at the pump dropped immediately once he was no longer controlling the scene with his voice. Janelle didn't celebrate. She didn't perform relief for anyone. She looked like someone who'd just dodged something she didn't want to think about. Officer Ramirez gave her contact information and instructions for sending over any additional recordings. He also explained what would likely happen next in the simplest terms, because the next part is where people get lost. Reports, evidence uploads, statements, follow-up calls, court dates if needed. Tina and Devin stayed nearby, not hovering, just present. It mattered that Janelle wasn't standing alone while paperwork got finished. It mattered that witnesses were willing to attach their names to what they'd observed, that she wasn't the problem customer, and that they were confident enough to push for camera footage. And meanwhile, Chase's original 911 call wasn't just floating in the air anymore. It became part of the case file. His words, how urgent he sounded, how sure he acted, how he described the alleged battery, were now evidence too. Back at the station, the pieces started lining up in a way Chase probably didn't anticipate. Officers had a false allegation of battery tied to a specific person, a phone video that contradicted the key claim, on-scene admission that he had no video proof, store employees willing to support the idea that the accused person wasn't creating problems, pending surveillance access that could further confirm or deny physical contact. That's not a messy he said, she said. That's a case with an obvious direction. And this is where viewers should ask themselves something. How many people have had the opposite outcome just because they didn't think to record? Over the next couple of days, the incident didn't disappear. Gas station staff talked. Regulars talked. People who weren't even there started hearing the story in pieces, first as gossip, then as a warning. But Janelle didn't run to social media immediately, even though Chase had tried to paint her like someone who would. She focused on the boring part, sending the videos to the officers, saving backups, and writing down everything she remembered while it was still fresh. Time, location, who said what, where everyone stood. That's what accountability actually looks like. Not a viral clip, a clean record. Chase, on the other hand, had a different kind of record being built around him now. His charge for making a false report wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It meant he'd have to answer for why he escalated a confrontation into a criminal accusation without proof. And once a prosecutor saw that phone video detail, the claim happening while the accused stood about 10 feet away, there was no way to pretend it was just confusion. The system doesn't always protect the right person, but when evidence is this clear, it becomes harder for anyone to ignore. And that's where the real consequences started. When Chase Whitaker's case hit court, he didn't look like the guy who demanded officers hurry. He looked like someone who'd finally realized that a 911 call didn't disappear just because the moment was over. The prosecutor didn't need a dramatic angle. The file already had a clean timeline. Chase had called police from the Loves on August 29, 2025, and reported a battery. He had identified Janelle Carter by outfit and car. He had described an arm grab as the reason for the call. Then, when officers arrived, Janelle had a phone recording that showed Chase repeating the allegation while she was clearly several steps away. Store employees had backed up that she was a regular who didn't cause trouble, and surveillance access had been initiated to confirm what the officers were already seeing. The physical contact claim didn't match reality. Chase tried to turn it into a story about disrespect and being embarrassed. He leaned on the argument that he felt threatened and reacted in the moment. But the court kept dragging it back to one point. He didn't report a feeling. He reported a specific act of violence. And when the judge looked at how the allegation was made, how it changed, and what the evidence showed, the case became about accountability for using the system as a weapon. The result wasn't a movie ending. It was the kind of ending that follows people quietly. Chase dealt with the consequences of being charged for a false report. The disorderly conduct and obstruction issues followed him too, tied to how he behaved during the response once officers started checking his story instead of accepting it. Court costs, penalties, and a case record were the kind of consequences that didn't go viral, but absolutely changed what future paperwork and background checks would look like. While Chase tried to manage fallout, Janelle did something that mattered more than arguing with anyone afterward. She treated the whole thing like a lesson in preserving proof. She submitted every video clip she had in full, with original timestamps intact. She saved backups in more than one place. She requested the incident report through the proper process and kept the confirmation trail. She wrote down the names connected to the case: Officer Luis Ramirez, Officer Shannon Price, Sergeant Dane Holt, plus the Love's staff who stepped up: Tina Alvarez and Devin Pike. Not to build a social media moment, to build a record. She also contacted Love's corporate customer relations, not to blame the store, but to make sure the location's cooperation and surveillance process were documented from the business side too. That move mattered because companies pay attention when an incident shows they could be pulled into liability or public scrutiny later. Love's didn't dismiss her. The store staff had done the right thing. They stayed neutral, offered surveillance access, and helped stabilize the situation by backing facts instead of drama. Inside that Love's after August 29th, the atmosphere shifted in small ways. Employees got quicker about pulling a manager in when someone started trying to control another customer. They stopped brushing off early warning signs like aggressive commands, following too close, and escalating a petty argument into a police-level accusation. Tina made sure staff understood the difference between a loud customer and a customer trying to use authority as a threat. Janelle didn't walk away thinking the world had suddenly become fair. She walked away knowing one ugly truth and one useful truth. The ugly truth was that she could do everything right and still be accused. The useful truth was that documentation could keep an accusation from turning into handcuffs. That night could have ended differently if one tiny detail hadn't been there. Video showing distance, clearly enough that nobody could pretend it was a mystery. So here's what this story really teaches. When someone tries to turn a personal confrontation into a police problem, staying calm is only half the battle. The other half is preserving the truth in a way the system can't ignore. Now let me ask you, if you were in Janelle's position, would you have started recording right away? Or would you have assumed the truth would speak for itself? Drop your answer in the comments, and if you want more story times where receipts beat loud accusations and accountability actually shows up, hit like, share this with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more.
Why are you here this late? What are you doing inside? Is this your store?
We're working. Nothing is happening here. Why are you treating this like a crime?
I've never seen it active at this hour.
Yeah,
so explain it. Prove it's yours.
If there's no alarm and no burglary call, what's the legal reason you're demanding proof?
The officer was standing in their doorway, like the store had tripped an invisible alarm. And Yema Khalif and Hawi Awash were already realizing this was not a quick check, because he kept demanding answers, like their presence needed permission. This is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous, until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part, if one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Before we run it back, comment where you're watching from. And if you watch these stories because you care about calm nerves, clean documentation, and real accountability, when authority starts pushing past its limits, hit like and subscribe, because that's exactly what this is. At around 1 a.m., Yema Khalif and Hawi Awash were inside their small neighborhood store in Tiburon, along with a third person who was with them that night, with the lights on and the space looking normal, like Late-night work was happening and nothing more. A police officer walked up and treated the scene like an issue that needed to be explained, not like a business handling its own night. He framed his approach as concern, but he kept circling the same suspicion, pressing them on why they were there, why they were open that late, and what they were doing, as if being inside was automatically something they had to justify. Yema and Howie stayed calm and answered in a steady way, but the officer kept escalating through repetition, acting like the fact that he personally had not seen the store active at that hour was enough reason to interrogate them. When they questioned why it mattered, he leaned into authority and tried to box them in with a simple power move. If it was not their store, then they had no standing to question him. And if it was their store, then they had to prove it to him. That was the trap, because either way the burden shifted onto Yema and Howie, and the officer positioned himself as the person who decided whether their explanation was acceptable. The situation tightened further when they noticed body language signaling escalation, including the officer keeping a hand in his pocket, and one of them asked him to de-escalate by removing it, not as a challenge, but as a safety boundary. Instead of treating that as a reasonable request, the officer made it about control, talking like it was his duty to protect the town and the property, while refusing to give basic accountability in return when Yema and Howie asked him to identify himself. That refusal was a turning point because it clarified the imbalance. He demanded answers, demanded compliance, demanded proof, but resisted even the simplest transparency about who he was. That was when Yema and Howie called out what they believed was the real trigger for the stop, pointing to the fact that there were 3 black people in the store late at night, and the officer tried to flatten it into a generic statement about 3 people of any background, but they kept the focus on the behavior, not the excuse. Not long after, additional officers arrived, including a supervisor, and the department's posture became the story, because now it was not one officer improvising. It was multiple officers deciding whether to correct the approach or reinforce it. The supervisor framed the encounter as standard policing, emphasizing the hour and claiming the store never had activity at that time. And Yema and Howie immediately demanded clarity about what the next step was, because they understood that vague suspicion could stretch forever if nobody forced it into specifics. The officers responded by demanding proof of ownership, pushing Yema and Howie to demonstrate they had keys and to physically use a key in the door as a test, as if the owners had to perform legitimacy in their own space just to make the pressure stop. Yema resisted because the demand was humiliating and backward, and the standoff held, with the officers pressing for a prove-it moment, and Yema and Howie refusing to be treated like suspects without a real reason. And that was the moment the entire situation balanced on a single detail: whether anyone outside the couple would validate what should never have needed validation. The standoff didn't get louder, but it got sharper, because the officers stopped pretending they were just curious and started acting like Yema Khalif and Howie Awash had to pass a test to earn basic respect inside their own store. The supervisor held the line for the department, repeating that the hour alone justified the stop, and the other officers backed it with that quiet crowd pressure that makes a simple interaction feel like a courtroom where the civilians are the only ones on trial. Yema and Howie kept asking for the next step, not because they were confused, but because they understood the danger of an open-ended investigation based on vibes, where the officers could keep stretching the encounter until someone finally snapped and gave them an excuse. The officers answered by demanding proof, insisting that the owners show they had keys and physically demonstrate access, framing it as an easy way to end the situation, like it was a harmless request and not a public humiliation ritual. Yema resisted immediately, because the demand wasn't neutral. It was the department saying, "Prove you belong here to our satisfaction," even though there was no burglary call, no alarm, and no evidence that any crime had happened. That resistance turned the moment into a power contest, because the officers didn't want to leave without winning something. And Yema didn't want to validate the idea that ownership needed to be performed for approval. Howie stayed steady beside him, reinforcing the same point with calm, clear pushback, keeping the focus on the logic. If there was no report of wrongdoing, then the officers needed a real reason to keep escalating. Not a feeling, not a hunch, not a personal opinion about what time a store should be active. The supervisor tried to keep it framed as normal policing, but the more he did that, the more it sounded like a policy problem, because normal in this context meant people getting treated like suspects purely because their presence looked unusual to an officer. The pressure built in small ways, with officers repeating the key demand, repeating the hour, repeating the idea that they were simply checking, while simultaneously treating a refusal as suspicious, which is the oldest trick in these encounters. Make compliance the only way out, then call anything else a threat. Yema and Howie didn't take the bait, and that mattered because they were playing the only chess game that works when you're outnumbered by authority. Stay calm, stay consistent, make them justify every step, and make sure the record shows who escalated and why. Then the tiny detail changed. A neighbor came up, described as a white resident from nearby, and spoke casually like this whole thing was obvious, vouching for Yema and Howie and confirming that it was their store. And the tone flipped so fast, it almost felt like a different scene. The officers immediately dropped the pressure, dropped the demands, dropped the posture, and shifted into polite closure, thanking the neighbor, acting friendly, and moving toward leaving, as if the last several minutes hadn't happened. That was the moment that exposed the real problem, because the owners didn't prove anything new about the store itself, and the officers didn't uncover any new facts about a crime, and no alarm suddenly appeared, and no report suddenly came in. The only thing that changed was whose voice carried weight. Yema and Howie had been saying calmly that there was no issue, that they belonged there, but that wasn't accepted as enough. The moment a white neighbor confirmed it, it became enough, and the encounter ended. That ending was the whole point, because it showed what the department was willing to treat as credible, and what it was willing to treat as questionable, even when the questionable thing was simply two owners standing in their own business at a late hour. Once the video circulated, the story stopped being about a late-night check and started being about a department getting caught on camera doing what people had been describing for years. Yema Khalif and Howie Awash didn't need to dramatize it because the footage did that work on its own. Multiple officers, no burglary call, no alarm, no concrete evidence of a crime. And still the owners were treated like they had to earn the right to exist in their own space. The backlash hit fast because the public could see the pattern clearly. Suspicion first, justification later, and then a sudden calm exit, the moment a white neighbor validated what the owners had been saying from the beginning. That public pressure pushed the situation out of the internal review zone and into a real-world consequences zone, where the town had to respond in a way that looked measurable. In the aftermath, Yema and Howie received a $150,000 settlement from the town of Tiburon, and they were explicit that the money wasn't just going into a private pocket, because they tied part of it to a scholarship effort connected to their store, aimed at supporting orphan youth in Ethiopia and Kenya. At the same time, the accountability didn't land neatly across every nearby jurisdiction involved, because the neighboring city, Belvedere, was not included in that settlement outcome the same way. And the broader fallout inside local law enforcement included major public scrutiny, internal shakeups, and leadership consequences that showed the department understood how bad it looked. But what mattered most was the choice Yema and Howie made about leverage. Instead of treating the settlement like an endpoint, they treated it like a bargaining chip, pushing the conversation toward policy changes that would outlive the headlines, because they understood something most people learned too late. Money closes a case, but reforms change the next case. So the focus shifted to what they demanded as part of the response. They pushed for updated policy and training standards, for a structure where community feedback wasn't just a comment box that got ignored, and for basic transparency tools that made it harder for officers to hide behind vagueness when people needed to file concerns. That's where the reforms started taking shape. A citizens' advisory panel was created as part of the response, and Yema and Howie were given seats, which mattered because it moved them from being treated like subjects of an incident to being treated like stakeholders with standing. Officers were also required to carry business cards that included clear information on how to file a complaint or concern, which sounds small, but it changes the power dynamic in everyday encounters because it makes the accountability path visible in the moment instead of buried later. A community liaison pilot program was introduced as another layer, aiming to narrow the gap between residents and law enforcement before incidents turned into confrontations. And the department increased the frequency of bias training, described as moving from a long cycle schedule to a tighter one, because the optics of "we do this once every several years" stopped sounding like professionalism and started sounding like negligence. Through all of it, Yema and Howie kept the core argument simple. The encounter was treated like a criminal scenario without any real criminal trigger, and the only reason it gained legitimacy in the officers' minds was when a white neighbor confirmed what the owners had already said. That's what made it a bias story, not a misunderstanding story. Because when there is no call, no alarm, and no evidence, but people still get forced to prove they belong, the proof was never about property. It was about permission. By the time the dust settled, the department's original framing didn't survive because the public had watched the same sequence too clearly to pretend it was routine. Yema Khalif and Howie Awash were treated like a problem first, and then everyone went searching for a reason second. That became the central contrast people couldn't unsee. There was no burglary call that night. There was no alarm going off. There was no report that anyone had forced entry. There was no concrete evidence of a crime in progress. Yet the owners still got boxed into an escalating set of demands where just answering wasn't enough and proving became the only exit. And the most telling piece wasn't even the demand for keys. It was how quickly the entire posture changed the moment a white neighbor vouched for them, because that moment showed the officers were not waiting on a fact. They were waiting on a specific kind of validation. That's why the community response didn't stay focused on one officer, because even when a supervisor arrived, the direction stayed the same. Treat the late hour as probable cause, treat refusal as suspicious, treat ownership as something that had to be demonstrated, and treat basic questions from the owners as if they were challenges to authority. So when backlash hit, it hit the department as a system. The fallout included public outrage, official embarrassment, and internal consequences that stretched beyond the street-level officers, because incidents like this forced leadership to choose between two options: admit the culture needs correction, or keep defending what the public can plainly see. In Tiburon, the visible response became a mix of settlement, reform promises, and structural changes that were designed to show this could not just be brushed away. The $150,000 settlement was one part, and Yema and Howie made sure it wasn't framed like hush money, tying part of it to a scholarship fund meant to benefit orphaned youth in Ethiopia and Kenya, because they wanted the outcome to produce something constructive instead of simply closing a file. But the bigger shift was what they demanded instead of chasing the largest possible payout. They pushed reforms that would change the daily mechanics of policing, not just the press releases. They pushed updated policies and training, and they pushed for community oversight through a citizens' advisory panel with seats for themselves, so the people who lived the consequences would have a voice in the process going forward. They pushed a business card requirement, so officers could not refuse basic identification and then disappear into the bureaucracy, and so residents would have a clear, immediate route to file concerns without having to guess what forms to find or who to call. They pushed a community liaison pilot because they understood that relationships don't get repaired through statements. They get repaired through consistent contact that doesn't start with suspicion. And they pushed more frequent bias training described as moving from a long gap between sessions to a tighter schedule. Because we do this once in a while. Stop sounding like prevention when the damage is already recorded and replayed. The narrator's takeaway landed where the footage always pointed. This was not about the store being open late. This was about who the officers believed belonged there without proof. Because when a business owner has to prove he belongs inside his own store without any real evidence that a crime is happening, the system is not responding to a threat, it is creating one. And the scariest part is how close encounters like that sit to the edge, where one wrong tone, one misunderstood movement, or one officer deciding to escalate can turn a ridiculous situation into a life-changing one. So if you made it to the end, drop where you're watching from. And tell me if you've ever seen a situation like this play out in your own town. Because the details change, but the pattern stays the same. And if you want more stories where calm people document everything and still force accountability when the badge tries to push past its limits, hit like, subscribe, and stay here. Because the next one is just as real.
You ran that red light. License and registration.
Officer, we're an ALS ambulance on an active trauma response. We cleared the intersection per protocol. Please, this call is time.
I'm not debating. Give me your info.
We are in a rush because someone could die if we're delayed.
Oh, don't interfere with my stop.
Post-industrial.
This was one of those situations that started off sounding almost ridiculous until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part, if one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Before we get into it, drop where you're watching from in the comments. And if you pay attention to stories about power, accountability, and moments where the system slips, hit like and subscribe. Because this entire story turns on minutes that never came back. This happened in Clearwater, Florida, on Gulf to Bay Boulevard near Belcher Road. Medic 12 sat on the shoulder with its emergency lights still flashing, painting the pavement red and blue. The siren wasn't fully blasting anymore, but it hadn't gone silent either. It let out that muted, restless whine ambulances make when they're supposed to be moving and aren't. Maya Chen was in the driver's seat. She was the lead paramedic on shift and the one responsible for getting them to the scene. Her hands were steady on the wheel, posture forward, eyes fixed ahead like she was ready to pull out at any second. Andre Ruiz sat in the passenger seat. The dispatch tablet was already open in his lap, the active trauma call glowing on the screen. He also had the printed run sheet in his hand. Timestamp, unit assignment, priority level, everything clearly documented. They weren't heading back to station. They weren't clearing a call. They were supposed to be first on scene. Minutes earlier, dispatch had sent them to a multi-vehicle crash with possible entrapment and 2 critical patients. Fire units were still en route. Medic 12 was the closest advanced life support unit available. That was why they were running lights and sirens. That was why time mattered. They had approached an intersection, slowed, cleared it, and proceeded through a red light exactly as protocol allowed. That was when the cruiser lit up behind them. At first, neither of them believed it. Emergency vehicles don't get stopped in the middle of active trauma responses, not like this. But when the loudspeaker came on ordering the ambulance to pull over, Maya made a split-second decision that would later be questioned from every angle. If she ignored the order, the situation could escalate. If it escalated, they'd lose even more time. So she pulled over. Officer Kyle Mercer stepped out of his patrol car like this was a standard traffic stop. 11 months on the job. Solo patrol. Still close enough to the academy that rules mattered more to him than context. He approached the driver's window already set on enforcement. He focused on the red light and ignored the emergency lights still flashing behind him. He demanded license and registration, as if this were a private vehicle and not a fully marked ambulance on an active call. Andre made sure the tablet stayed visible. He held the run sheet up where it could be seen. Everything needed to verify. The emergency was right there. Mercer barely looked at it. From his posture and pacing, it was clear he'd already decided the stop was about control. He didn't ask dispatch to verify. He didn't call a supervisor. He treated the moment like a challenge to his authority instead of a medical emergency unfolding somewhere else. Maya stayed calm. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She followed protocol and radioed dispatch, reporting that they were being held on a traffic stop while responding to an active trauma call and requesting police supervision. Dispatch confirmed what was already true. The call was active. Medic 12 was still primary. They began trying to reach police command. But cross-channel communication is slow when seconds matter. While radios crackled and calls stacked up, Mercer ran IDs. Everything came back clean. No flags, no issues, no reason to continue the stop. And yet, he didn't release them. Instead, he started writing a citation. This was the moment where time stopped being theoretical. Every second the pen moved across that paper was another second without advanced care at the crash scene. Andre understood it immediately. He tried to de-escalate, suggesting the officer follow them and handle any issue later. Mercer shut that down and warned him not to interfere. 14 minutes passed before a supervisor finally intervened and ordered the ambulance released. By then, the outcome was already sliding into place. Maya pulled back onto Gulf to Bay hard, lights blazing, sirens screaming again. The crash scene was only 2 minutes away. 2 minutes too late. 2 minutes after being released, Medic 12 hit the crash scene on Gulf to Bay like a sprint that started 14 minutes too late. Fire engines had just arrived. Their lights were already bouncing off twisted metal and scattered glass. The road was a grid of hazards, angled bumpers, steam, debris, and people standing in shock near the shoulder with phones in their hands. Because that's what people do now when something terrible happens in public. Captain Rob Mallory was already in motion, directing his crew towards the worst impact point. He saw the ambulance and his first reaction wasn't relief. It was confusion. Medic 12 was the closest unit. Everybody on that scene knew that. In a response like this, the first ALS rig should have been there early, not arriving behind the first wave of suppression. Mallory met them the second they stepped out. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He demanded to know where they had been. Not because he wanted an argument, because he needed to understand what the scene had already lost. Maya answered in one line, clean and blunt. A traffic stop. That landed wrong at first, the way a sentence sounds when the brain rejects it. Mallory made her repeat it, not because he didn't hear, but because he couldn't accept that it was real. While that exchange happened, Andre was already scanning for patients, doing what experienced medics do when they know the clock has been running without them. He moved fast, but not frantic. Fast enough to be useful, controlled enough to be accurate. There were 2 victims flagged as critical. Lauren Bishop was one of them. Teacher, mom of 2, the kind of name that would later be said carefully on the news. Frank Delgado was the other. Construction supervisor, someone who spent his life on job sites and would be described later as dependable, the guy who always showed up. Firefighters had done what they could with what they had. They had controlled hazards, established scene safety, started basic interventions. But fire crews weren't ALS. They didn't carry the same meds, the same advanced airway capability, the same cardiac tools. They could hold the line. They couldn't replace the ambulance that was supposed to already be there. Mallory's crew had just finished a quick assessment on one of the victims and relayed what they'd seen. There had been faint signs when they arrived. Not a miracle, not a guarantee. Just enough to make the next few minutes matter. And that was the part nobody could undo. Maya and Andre moved in with the efficiency of people who've done this 1,000 times. No drama, no big gestures, just hands and eyes and protocols firing in sequence. They checked for pulse. They checked breathing. They checked responsiveness. They reassessed, because good medics don't accept the first answer when the stakes are this high. Andre found nothing. Maya confirmed it. No pulse, no signs of life. The kind of confirmation that goes quiet in your head even while everything around you stays loud. And in that moment, the traffic stop stopped being an argument about rules. It became an event with a measurable cost. Because there's a difference between being late and being late when someone still had a chance. Maya didn't collapse. Andre didn't curse. They didn't act out. They did what professionals do when the outcome is already sealed. They documented, they communicated, they moved to the next task because a scene like that doesn't pause for grief. But the scene felt it anyway. Mallory looked at the ambulance like it had arrived from another timeline, one where it should have been there earlier and wasn't. His confusion turned into a cold, focused anger, not at the medics, but at the idea that a patrol stop could override a trauma response. That kind of anger doesn't stay on the roadside, it travels. And by the time the scene wrapped and the units cleared, the most important thing about that night wasn't the wreck itself. It was the 14 minutes that vanished on the shoulder of the road, while a citation was written like time was unlimited. The story didn't explode because people were emotional. It exploded because everything was recorded. Back on Gulf to Bay, after the scene cleared and the chaos settled into paperwork, Maya and Andre did what experienced crews always did after something went wrong in a way that wasn't medical. They documented the timeline like it would be read later by people who weren't there, because they knew it would. The run sheet already had the basics: dispatch timestamp, call type, unit assignment. The tablet had the live call history. Their radio traffic was logged. And behind them, Officer Kyle Mercer's body camera had been running for the entire stop. His voice, his posture, his pacing, his choices. This wasn't going to come down to opinion. It was going to come down to minutes and proof. The first thing that made this different was how clean the verification could have been. Andre had put the dispatch screen in the officer's line of sight. He had physically held a printed run sheet like a receipt for reality. Medic 12 didn't need a debate. They needed one radio call. That call didn't happen. Instead, Mercer turned it into a roadside process. IDs were run, nothing hit. No warrants, no issues. Yet the stop didn't end, because by then it wasn't about confirming an emergency. It was about finishing the ticket. That detail mattered later, because once it was obvious the ambulance was legitimate, every additional second became harder to justify. Dispatch had tried to clean it up from their end. They confirmed emergency status was active. They attempted cross-channel contact with the police department. They escalated the request. But it wasn't a direct line. It never was. It was relays and hold times and someone trying to reach someone else, while the scene on Gulf to Bay kept moving without advanced care. That's how systems fail, without anyone having to raise their voice. Sergeant Dana Holloway got pulled into it the way supervisors always do. Late because the system wasn't designed for speed between agencies, only for documentation after the fact. When she finally reached Mercer, the first thing she needed was the reason, not the general concept, the exact reason. Why an emergency vehicle marked as active trauma response was being held on the shoulder. Mercer's justification was simple. He had seen the ambulance go through a red light and decided traffic enforcement still applied. Holloway's response wasn't philosophical. It was operational. Emergency vehicles had protocol. Verification could be done by radio. If there was an issue, it could be addressed after the call, without freezing a trauma response on the roadside. She ordered him to clear the ambulance. That should have been the end of it. But Mercer didn't pivot fast. That was another point the footage later made painfully clear. There was a stall, a finish-the-process hesitation, the kind of delay that feels small to the person holding the pen and enormous to the people staring at a dispatch clock. When the release finally happened, it didn't look like teamwork. It looked like a lecture attached to paperwork. And that became the second thing that made this blow up, the tone. Because in situations like this, departments can sometimes hide behind the fog of confusion, miscommunication, bad radio, unclear status. But Mercer's body cam didn't show confusion. It showed certainty. It showed an officer treating a trauma response like a teachable moment for compliance. Meanwhile, the fire captain's reaction at the scene got documented too, because fire crews record, by report if not by camera. The absence of ALS on arrival was noted. The presence of faint signs earlier was noted. The timeline became a straight line: stop, delay, arrival, outcome. And once the line was drawn, people started asking the same question in different ways. Because in modern America, you don't just have witnesses, you have footage. And by the time the internal conversations began, this wasn't just an incident anymore, it was a record. Once this hit the outside world, it stopped being an internal matter overnight. The reason was simple. There were too many records telling the same story. Dispatch logs showed Medic 12 was primary on an active trauma call. Radio traffic showed Maya requested a PD supervisor while still on that call. Fire reports showed ALS should have arrived earlier and Mercer's Bodycam captured the rest. An officer treating an emergency ambulance like a routine traffic stop while the clock kept running. By the next morning, reporters weren't chasing rumors. They were chasing a timeline. And the phrase that made people freeze when they heard it, because it sounded too dumb to be real, was the same one Captain Rob Mallory reacted to at the scene. Traffic stop. That phrase spread because it explained the one thing everyone kept asking: why the closest ALS unit arrived late. When the department stepped in front of cameras, they didn't have room to soften it. The chief called it indefensible and confirmed the obvious point. The officer knew it was an ambulance with emergency lights active. That killed the easiest excuse. The idea it was confusion, it wasn't. It was a choice. The union's first response tried to hide behind training language, implying the officer was simply enforcing rules and following procedure. But that line collapsed fast because procedure doesn't look like ignoring a dispatch tablet and a printed run sheet, refusing quick radio verification, and continuing the stop after IDs came back clean. And it definitely doesn't look like delaying release even after a supervisor gets involved. Public pressure forced the messaging to shift from defense to distance. Inside internal affairs, the investigation didn't start with feelings. It started with timestamps. They overlaid dispatch assignment, unit status, radio transmissions, and the exact window of the stop. The number that kept coming back was 14 minutes. Not a momentary check, but long enough to change what late means in trauma care. Maya and Andre's statements were tight and consistent. Active trauma dispatch. Proof presented immediately. Supervisor requested through dispatch. Release delayed anyway. Captain Mallory's documentation focused on the gap. ALS was missing when it mattered, and included the detail that one victim had shown faint signs when fire arrived before advanced care ever touched them. Sergeant Dana Holloway's involvement made the failure even clearer. She instructed Mercer to clear the ambulance and verify by radio, not roadside. That created the core problem Mercer couldn't outrun. The entire stop could have been verified in seconds. One call to dispatch, one quick confirmation. Instead, he ran the stop like a normal enforcement scenario, ran IDs, found nothing, and still chose to write a citation while an active trauma call stayed pending. The case turned on one question that kept getting asked in different rooms by different people. Why didn't he verify by dispatch immediately? Because once that's asked, everything else becomes secondary. You can argue about traffic laws all day, but you can't justify refusing the fastest verification method available when the consequences are measured in survival windows. By the time depositions began, Mercer's explanation narrowed into a weak defense. He believed rules applied equally, and he was enforcing the law. The attorneys didn't fight him on philosophy. They pinned him to operational reality. They forced the comparison between what he could have done, radio verification and release, and what he did do, roadside detention and a ticket. And then they landed the question that ended the debate, whether his principle outweighed medical protocol when lives were on the line. After that, consequences weren't optional. They were unavoidable. Mercer was suspended and fined. The department moved to separate from him, and he resigned before he could be formally terminated because the footage made him radioactive for any agency that might consider hiring him. In law enforcement, that kind of documented, high-profile failure doesn't fade. It follows you. Civil lawsuits followed the same logic as the investigation. Preventable delay, documented deviation from protocol, fatal outcome. The city settled wrongful death claims for a combined amount around $4 million. Not because money fixes anything, but because the city couldn't argue the timeline away. And the last consequence was the one departments only make when they know the public saw the truth. Policy change. Clearwater updated procedures so that if an officer ever stops an emergency vehicle, the officer must contact dispatch immediately and must have supervisor authorization to continue holding that vehicle. In other words, no more roadside ego games with a trauma call on the clock. That's the part people don't like admitting. This didn't require a new invention or special training. It required one basic step that was available the entire time. Verify fast, then clear the ambulance. In the end, Mercer couldn't hide behind rules or rules. The footage and timestamps showed the ambulance could have been verified in seconds, but he chose to hold them anyway, and kept holding them even after a supervisor told him to clear it. He was suspended, fined, and resigned, and that kind of documented failure made him effectively unhireable in law enforcement. The city settled the wrongful death cases for about $4 million, and Clearwater updated policy so any officer stopping an emergency vehicle must verify with dispatch immediately and need supervisor authorization to keep that vehicle stopped. Now tell me, was that justice or paperwork pretending to be accountability? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and like and subscribe for more stories where the truth gets recorded and consequences actually follow.